Most people believe that extraordinary discipline comes from some magical burst of motivation, as if successful individuals wake up each morning overflowing with fire and passion that propels them forward. But the truth is far quieter, far less glamorous, and far more uncomfortable than what most people imagine. When you truly pay attention to people who achieve remarkable things, you'll notice something almost unsettling: they don't wait for motivation at all. They don't chase inspirational videos, they don't need perfect songs to get started, and they don't negotiate with themselves about whether they feel ready or not. While most of the world is still lying in bed scrolling through their phones, half asleep and convincing themselves that today is not the right day to begin, these individuals have already taken their first decisive step. Not loudly, not dramatically, but with a steady, rooted certainty. And if you watch long enough, you begin to see the difference. Where others stall, they move. Where others hesitate, they commit. Where others wait for the right moment, they create one. They're not relying on emotional highs or bursts of inspiration, they're guided by something deeper, something older, something almost ancient in its simplicity. It's not excitement that carries them. It's identity. Their actions aren't performed because they feel good, they're performed because these actions are a non-negotiable part of who they believe themselves to be. That's the part most people never understand. You can try to motivate yourself endlessly, repeat affirmations, set goals, watch motivational speeches, but if you still see yourself as someone who needs motivation before acting, you'll remain trapped in the same cycle forever. What truly separates the consistent from the inconsistent isn't passion or talent, it's the invisible inner command they obey, even when every emotion inside them begs for rest. There is a force that carries them forward that has nothing to do with positivity, excitement, or enthusiasm. A force that refuses to kneel before feelings. A force so deeply embedded that action becomes almost automatic. This force was once given a name in ancient Japan, long before the world turned discipline into a trend. A name that described the inner spirit that pushes a person forward even when the mind is exhausted and the heart is unsure. A name that represented the quiet strength of those who do the difficult things simply because it must be done. That name was Yamato Damashi, the spirit that moves even when the body hesitates. In its original form, Yamato Damashi had nothing to do with war or nationalism or superiority. In fact, the deepest essence of it wasn't about conquering others, it was about conquering yourself. It was the force that turned ordinary men into leaders, scholars into masters, and warriors into legends. It wasn't loud, and it wasn't violent. It was the internal anchor that stopped a man from collapsing when his strength failed. The voice that whispered stand when fear screamed run. The part of the soul that kept a person walking long after the fire of motivation had died out. Today, most people have forgotten this idea entirely. They trade real commitment for temporary excitement, trading long-term identity for short-lived emotion. They confuse effort with intention and confuse desire with direction. But if you strip everything away, the quotes, the videos, the speeches, the hype, you're left with a single truth: the person who acts without waiting to feel ready will always surpass the person who waits for perfect conditions. That is the essence of Yamato Damashi. That is the difference between knowing what to do and becoming the kind of person who simply does it. Most people don't realize that motivation comes in two very different forms, and confusing them is the reason so many continue to feel stuck. The first form is the one everyone chases, that spark of excitement you get after hearing a powerful story, watching an inspiring video, or imagining the version of yourself you want to become. It's the kind of motivation that fills your chest with warmth and makes you believe that change is finally within reach. But this feeling is fragile. It evaporates the moment discomfort appears. It collapses when you're tired. It fades when life becomes inconvenient. It's like a flame dancing on top of water, bright for a second, gone the moment reality touches it. Most people rely on this feeling, and because of that, they start strong but disappear just as quickly. The second form is something far deeper, something so rare that only a few people ever learn to wield it, the motivation that comes from purpose, from identity, from an unwavering sense of inner duty. It's not emotional. It's not loud. It doesn't give you goosebumps. Instead, it sits inside you like a quiet, unshakable truth. The Japanese had a word for this, ikigai, the reason for your being. It's the force that doesn't get weaker when you're tired, it gets clearer. It's the force that doesn't disappear when you fail, it grows sharper. It's the force that stays when every other form of motivation has died. This deeper motivation doesn't come from excitement, it comes from alignment. It comes from knowing exactly who you are and what you stand for, even when your emotions disagree. The truth is, you cannot rely on the fleeting type of motivation if you want to transform your life. Every time you depend on inspiration, you're signing up for disappointment. You'll work hard only when you feel like it. You'll make promises only when your mood supports them. You'll chase progress only on days when energy shows up naturally. And when that excitement fades, as it always does, you go back to zero. Again and again. That cycle destroys dreams more effectively than fear ever could. But the second kind of motivation, the kind rooted in identity, doesn't care whether you feel ready or not. It moves you because it is you. When you act from this place, discipline stops feeling like effort and becomes expression. You train because someone like you trains. You study because someone like you studies. You build because someone like you builds. You stop asking, "Do I feel like it today?" because that question simply doesn't exist anymore. You don't negotiate with your identity, you honor it. This is exactly why so many people watch motivational videos but never change. They don't lack effort, they lack identity. They try to use emotion to fuel transformation when transformation requires something much stronger. They think knowing what to do is enough. They think planning is progress. They think excitement equals commitment. But knowledge without identity is powerless. Intention without action is useless. And motivation without duty is empty. If you truly want to evolve, you must stop chasing temporary emotional highs and start building the kind of inner foundation that doesn't crumble when life gets heavy. You must develop a sense of responsibility to the version of yourself you promised to become. That responsibility, that duty, is the core of Yamato Damashi. It doesn't ask whether you're inspired. It doesn't ask whether you're comfortable. It simply whispers, act because it is your nature to act. And when you finally grasp that truth, everything about the way you live begins to change. The story of Tadayoshi begins in a time when Japan was a land of rigid hierarchies, ancient customs, and unspoken expectations. Born into a respected noble family, he had access to a world most could only imagine, shelves lined with scrolls imported from China, teachings from wise monks, strategies from brilliant generals, philosophies from centuries past. While other young nobles spent their days laughing over cups of sake, writing delicate poetry beneath blossoming cherry trees, or trying to impress court maidens, Tadayoshi buried himself in study. He devoured knowledge with a hunger rare even among scholars. He memorized passages, analyzed tactics, decoded patterns within patterns. He knew every formation, every maneuver, every theory. His mind was sharp, precise, disciplined, a weapon in itself. Yet for all his knowledge, Tadayoshi lived with a quiet, suffocating truth: he could not bring himself to act. Each sunrise he told himself the same story: today he would begin his training, today he would step into the life he had imagined, today he would finally transform intention into action. But each time, a new excuse appeared, cleverly disguised as logic. A new scroll he hadn't finished. A new detail he didn't fully understand. A technique he should read one more time before practicing. His mind whispered questions that felt intelligent but were actually chains. What if I'm not ready? What if I train inefficiently? What if I make mistakes? Shouldn't I have complete mastery of the theory first? So he read. And he studied. And he planned. While the sun climbed the sky and slipped into the horizon, Tadayoshi remained in the safety of his room, surrounded by knowledge he never applied. And each night, he whispered the same empty promise to himself: tomorrow. It became his ritual, a ritual of avoidance clothed in the elegance of scholarship. People noticed. Servants exchanged whispers behind screens. Young nobles smirked behind painted fans, calling him the warrior of books. A man who could recite entire war manuals but had never truly lifted a sword with intention. Their words left invisible wounds on Tadayoshi's spirit, but the harshest blow came from his father, a man who had lived through bloodshed, who had felt the weight of real battle. One evening, as Tadayoshi proudly explained a strategy he had studied, hoping for approval, his father interrupted him with a single sentence that shattered him entirely: "You possess the mind of a general, but the heart of a scribe." Those words echoed through him like thunder rolling across mountains. All his knowledge, all his reading, all his careful study suddenly felt hollow. His father hadn't meant to insult him, he had simply spoken the truth Tadayoshi had spent years avoiding. That night he lay awake, staring at the ceiling, his mind racing, his heart heavy. He realized something terrifying: he was becoming a man who knew everything and did nothing. A man who mistook preparation for progress. A man who used intelligence to justify fear. A man trapped not by weakness, but by hesitation. And yet, something shifted inside him when morning came. For the first time in years, he did not reach for a scroll. He did not plan, analyze, or overthink. Instead, as if guided by something deeper than thought, he walked out of his house. His feet carried him toward the forest, away from comfort, away from routine, away from the identity he had clung to for so long. He didn't know what he was searching for. But something in him knew he had to start walking, because staying still had become unbearable. As Tadayoshi wandered through the forest that morning, he felt a strange mixture of shame, hope, and confusion swirling inside him. The trees stood tall and silent, their branches trembling softly with the early breeze. The sunlight had barely begun to filter through the leaves, painting the ground in broken, trembling patterns. He walked without direction, guided only by the heaviness in his chest and the quiet voice inside him that whispered that something had to change. Each step felt like an escape, from who he had been, from the expectations he failed to meet, from the crushing realization that knowledge hadn't made him strong. He didn't know what he was looking for. But he knew he could no longer stay where he was. Then he heard it, a rhythm unlike anything in the forest. A steady, measured sound, thwack, swish, thwack. Wood striking wood. Air splitting around a blade. The sound repeated with perfect precision, each strike identical to the one before it, as if time itself was being carved into equal pieces. Drawn toward the sound, Tadayoshi pushed through a curtain of branches and found himself at the edge of a clearing. And there, at the center, stood a man who looked carved by experience rather than age. His hair was streaked with gray, tied back in a simple knot. His arms were lined with old scars, pale marks that resembled lightning frozen in the skin. He held a wooden sword, and with each movement, he repeated the exact same cut. No variation. No hesitation. No wasted motion. He wasn't training. He was embodying something. Something steady, disciplined, unshakable. Tadayoshi watched, mesmerized. The man did not pause to catch his breath. He did not stop to loosen his grip or stretch his muscles. He simply continued, cut after cut, stance after stance, each one identical, each one precise. There was no emotion on his face, no frustration, no pride, no excitement. Just presence. Pure presence. A man existing in action. For the first time in his life, Tadayoshi understood what discipline actually looked like. It wasn't loud. It wasn't beautiful. It wasn't glamorous. It was repetition that didn't complain and effort that didn't announce itself. When the man finally stopped, Tadayoshi stepped forward instinctively, something inside him pulling him toward the figure like a compass aligning with its true direction. "Master," he said quietly, the words slipping out as naturally as breath. "I've watched you train. I've never seen discipline like yours. Please, teach me." The man turned slowly and regarded him with eyes that had seen more than Tadayoshi could ever imagine. He took in Tadayoshi's soft hands, his fine silk clothing, his noble posture. And with a single, flat word, he rejected him. No, then he turned to leave. Panic surged through Tadayoshi's chest. Please, he called out, voice cracking. I've studied everything, strategy, tactics, philosophy, I know the teachings of Sun Tzu, the writings of the great masters. I can learn quickly. The man stopped. Turned back. Something flickered in his eyes, not interest, but amusement at the contradiction in front of him. You know techniques, the man said. Good. Go use them. And he began walking again. The rejection broke something inside Tadayoshi, his pride, his fear, his precious identity as the scholar noble. The pieces of that identity fell away, leaving the raw truth exposed. He stepped forward again, desperate, breath trembling. Please. I need to become more than I am. The man paused. This time, he did not walk away. But he also did not make it easy. You're going to give up, he said without turning. Tadayoshi didn't hesitate. Everyone gives up, he replied softly. I will not. The man finally faced him. Looked into him. And after a long silence, he spoke, tomorrow. Before sunrise. Here. If you come, I will consider teaching you. If you do not, never return. Tadayoshi nodded, heart pounding. The man almost smiled, not in kindness, but in skepticism. Promises, he muttered. Everyone makes them. And then he vanished between the trees, leaving Tadayoshi alone in the clearing, gripping his first fragile thread of transformation. Tadayoshi barely slept that night. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the man's face, cold, unreadable, carved by discipline instead of emotion. His words echoed relentlessly in Tadayoshi's mind, you're going to give up. It stung more than any insult ever had, not because it was cruel, but because Tadayoshi feared it might be true. Yet something deeper inside him refused to accept it. For the first time in his life, a promise wasn't just something he said, it felt like something he had to protect, something he had to defend against the old version of himself. His heart was restless, his thoughts loud, his spirit trembling between fear and determination. Before dawn even touched the horizon, Tadayoshi slipped out of his home. The air was colder than he expected. Mist clung to the ground, curling around his ankles like pale smoke. His legs ached from anxious tension, but he kept walking, each step driven more by stubbornness than confidence. When he reached the clearing, darkness still blanketed the trees. He stood alone in the silence, breath rising in faint clouds, the world utterly still. And he waited. Minutes passed. Then almost without sound, the man appeared, as if the forest itself had shaped him out of shadow and mist. His presence was sharp and unsettling, quiet but heavy with authority. He looked at Tadayoshi not with approval, but with a kind of detached curiosity, as if examining a candle flame to see whether it would survive the wind. You came, the man said flatly. It wasn't praise. It was simply an observation, one that carried a second meaning. Let's see how long that lasts. Tadayoshi straightened his posture. I said I would. The man exhaled softly, almost disappointed. Words are cheap. Without further explanation, he instructed Tadayoshi to assume a basic warrior stance, knees bent, spine aligned, arms extended, wooden sword held parallel to the ground. At first, Tadayoshi felt confident. He had read about this stance multiple times. He knew the theory. But within minutes, reality crushed the illusion. His legs began to shake violently. His lower back burned. His arms grew heavy, trembling with every breath. Sweat dripped down his temples despite the cold. 5 minutes in, he gritted his teeth. 10 minutes in, he felt agony blooming through every muscle. 15 minutes in, his body screamed louder than his resolve. Master, he gasped, voice breaking, I don't think I can. Silence. The command cut through the air like steel. The man, Ko, sat calmly on a rock, watching him with eyes that revealed nothing. Your mind is telling you to stop. It lies. And you have obeyed those lies your entire life. Tadayoshi's legs buckled. Pain surged like fire. Tears pricked his eyes, not from sadness, but from the raw, overwhelming physical strain. He felt himself collapsing forward, arms trembling uncontrollably until the wooden sword slipped from his hand and hit the ground. He fell to his knees, panting, shaking, defeated. Ko rose slowly and walked toward him. Tadayoshi prepared himself for reassurance, a comforting word, some acknowledgement of his effort. Instead, Ko looked down at him with pure disappointment. 15 minutes, he said quietly. And you break. Do you think battle waits for your comfort? Do you think life pauses so you can catch your breath? You are soft because you have lived in your mind, not your body. Shame flooded Tadayoshi. But something else rose with it, anger. Not at Ko. At himself. I can do better, Tadayoshi said through clenched teeth, forcing himself to stand on trembling legs. Let me try again. Ko studied him carefully. Something subtle shifted in his eyes, not approval, but recognition of a spark that hadn't existed moments earlier. You think this feeling will last? Ko asked. This burst of determination? It will fade by tomorrow. That is why you fail. Tadayoshi swallowed hard. Then teach me something that doesn't fade. Ko paused. Then, slowly, he nodded. Duty, he said. Not emotion. Duty is what remains when comfort dies. Duty is what moves you when desire fails. If you truly want to become someone new, you must learn to act from duty, not feeling. The words carved themselves into Tadayoshi's spirit. And as Ko turned away, he added one final challenge: we have a name for this. Yamato Damashi. If you want to understand it, then come back tomorrow. The next morning arrived like a punishment from the heavens. Tadayoshi's entire body felt as if it had been torn apart and poorly stitched back together. His thighs pulsed with a dull, throbbing ache. His shoulders felt heavy, as though he had carried stones through the night. Even turning in bed sent waves of pain up his spine. And yet, he rose. Not because he felt ready, he absolutely didn't. Not because he was excited, he wasn't. He rose because Ko's words from the day before lingered like an oath on his skin: duty is what remains when feeling dissolves. Every step toward the forest hurt. But the pain wasn't discouraging anymore. It was an announcement that yesterday's version of him had died, and a new one was being forced into existence. The sky was still dark when he reached the clearing. The trees stood tall and silent, watching him like old judges deciding whether he deserved entry. Tadayoshi waited, breath uneven, sweat beading his forehead despite the cold air. And then Ko appeared, silent, steady, exactly as he had the day before. You came again. Ko didn't sound surprised, curious, or impressed. It was simply another fact, another observation carved without emotion. I said I'd return, Tadayoshi answered. Ko stepped closer, studying him with those sharp, penetrating eyes that seemed to see the truth beneath every word. Yesterday, you said it with emotion. Today, you say it with exhaustion. Which one speaks from your core? Tadayoshi took a breath. Today. Ko nodded once, a barely visible shift. Good. Then your training begins. He didn't start with a stance this time. Instead, he motioned for Tadayoshi to sit on the ground. Tadayoshi obeyed, confused but silent. Ko lowered himself onto a fallen log across from him, folding his arms. You've read many books, he said. Tell me what you learned. Tadayoshi straightened. I've studied battle strategy, the teachings of ancient generals, the philosophy of tactics, the psychology of combat, and it made you strong? Ko interrupted abruptly. Tadayoshi swallowed. No, why not? For a moment, Tadayoshi struggled to find the right answer. His instinct was to say that reading wasn't enough. But that wasn't exactly true, knowledge was valuable. His father had always praised him for how much he knew. But Ko wasn't asking about the value of reading. He was asking about the distance between knowledge and action. Because I didn't do anything with it, Tadayoshi said quietly. Ko nodded. Partially correct. But the deeper truth is this: the knowledge you worshipped can only guide your thinking mind. A warrior's strength comes from the part of himself that isn't ruled by thought. Ko pointed 2 fingers toward his own chest. Inside every man, there are 2 selves. One that talks, thinks, hesitates, calculates. The other that acts, moves, and does not wait for permission. You've spent your entire life feeding the first self and starving the second. Tadayoshi felt those words strike like arrows. He had always admired warriors, yet lived like a scholar pretending to be one. Ko continued, your ancestors knew a truth you've never lived: knowledge without soul is like a sword without a wielder. Beautiful, but useless. Strategy is nothing if the body cannot endure the simplest hardship. Ko stood suddenly. Come with me. He led Tadayoshi deeper into the forest. The air felt sharper, colder. They emerged at a riverbank where water rushed violently over rocks, icy and relentless. Mist rose from the surface like smoke from a battlefield. Ko pointed toward the center of the river. Stand on that rock. In the stance I taught you. Until I say otherwise. Tadayoshi stared at the freezing water. His breath caught. How long must I stay? Until you understand something you can't learn from books. Tadayoshi felt fear crawl up his spine, but fear was a feeling. And yesterday, Ko had begun teaching him something stronger. He stepped into the river. His skin ignited with shock. The cold wasn't cold, it was pain. The kind of pain that steals breath and thought in a single instant. Ko watched him without blinking. Good, he said calmly. Now, begin. The shock of the river was unlike anything Tadayoshi had ever experienced. The moment his feet submerged, the freezing current attacked him like a swarm of invisible blades. Water surged around his ankles, biting into his skin, numbing the bone beneath. He staggered, struggling against the force of the current, but he managed to climb onto the central rock. The surface was slick, uneven, unforgiving. He planted his feet as firmly as he could and assumed the stance Ko had drilled into him. Knees bent. Back straight. Arms extended. Breath controlled. A posture of readiness, or at least the closest he could manage in this hellish cold. At first, his mind screamed louder than his body. This is madness, this is unbearable, this is impossible. Each thought struck like a hammer, urging him to escape, to run, to reclaim the warmth of comfort he had abandoned. But Ko's voice cut through the rising panic like a blade through fog. Hold. One word. Plain. Absolute. Tadayoshi clenched his jaw, focusing on the word as though it were the only thing preventing him from dissolving into the river. Minutes passed, though time felt distorted. The cold crawled up his legs, sinking its claws deeper into his flesh. Soon he couldn't feel his toes at all. Waves splashed against his shins, soaking his clothes. The icy water seeped into his bones until it felt like fire made of frost. His thighs trembled uncontrollably, every muscle begging to collapse. His breath became shaky, ragged. His vision blurred at the edges. Master, Tadayoshi called out, his voice fragile. I can't. I can't take this. Ko didn't move. Didn't flinch. Didn't soften. You feel cold, Ko said, his voice carrying over the rushing water. You feel pain. You feel fear. And you think these feelings matter. He crossed his arms. They don't. The river roared, drowning out Tadayoshi's thoughts. The cold gnawed at him relentlessly, turning seconds into small eternities. His mind spiraled, desperate for escape. Why am I here? Why am I doing this? What's the point? But Ko's next word struck him with the force of a war drum. You believe feelings define your limits. They don't. They only define your comfort. Tatoyoshi's teeth chattered violently. Every breath felt like inhaling shards of ice. Ko stepped closer to the water's edge. Your ancestors fought battles in winter blizzards, wounded, starving, dying. They marched through cold worse than this for days, not minutes. Some of them held the line while arrows rained from the sky. Others stood guard through freezing nights knowing the enemy waited in silence. He raised his voice. You think you're suffering? You haven't even begun. Tadayoshi tried to respond but the cold stole his voice. His muscles spasmed. The stance that once felt simple now felt like enduring a lifetime of torment. Every instinct screamed at him to quit, to leap from the rock, to run back to shore and collapse. This was beyond discomfort. Beyond endurance. It was war, a war within himself. Suddenly, something inside him snapped. Or rather, something inside him surrendered. The endless resistance, the internal fight against the cold, the complaining voice in his mind, it all fell away. He stopped arguing with the pain. Stopped cursing the cold. Stopped wishing the situation were different. He simply accepted it. A strange calm spread through him, subtle but unmistakable. His shaking slowed. His breath steadied. The water didn't become warm, but it lost its power to dominate his mind. Ko saw it instantly. There, he said quietly. That is the doorway. The moment you stop fighting reality and begin facing it. Tatoyoshi stood on the rock, drenched and trembling, but something new glowed inside him, a flicker of resilience he had never felt before. A resilience not born from strength, but from surrendering his attachment to comfort. Minutes later, though it felt like years, Ko finally shouted, Enough. Come. Tadayoshi stumbled off the rock and waded through the river. His legs barely responded, his feet numb as stones. Ko helped him to shore, wrapped a cloak around him, and guided him toward a fire. You endured, Ko said. Not because you felt strong, but because you stopped letting feelings command you. As the fire warmed his shivering body, Tadayoshi realized something. He hadn't just stood on a rock in a freezing river. He had taken his first step toward becoming someone new. That night, after the ordeal at the river, Ko allowed Tadayoshi to rest earlier than usual. But before dismissing him, the master motioned for him to sit by the fire. The flames crackled softly, casting gold and amber shadows across Ko's scarred face. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The only sound was the rushing river behind them, the same river that had nearly broken Tadayoshi hours before. Finally, Ko spoke. Do you know why I'm teaching you all of this? His voice was calmer than Tadayoshi had ever heard it. Tadayoshi shook his head slowly. He was exhausted, barely able to keep his eyes open, but he forced himself to stay alert. Ko didn't talk often. When he did, every word mattered. You remind me of the nobles from long ago, Ko began, staring into the fire. Men who studied every art, every philosophy, every tactic, yet never acted. They admired bravery in poems but never showed it in life. They worshipped discipline in their writings but lived without a shred of it. Tadayoshi felt those words sting, because they described him perfectly, a man overflowing with theory, empty in action. Our ancestors saw this flaw, Ko continued. They realized something critical: knowledge is borrowed. Spirit is earned. Anyone can learn from a book, but only a few can shape themselves into someone who acts despite pain, fear, and doubt. Ko paused and tapped his chest. This inner fire, was called Yamato Damashi. The Japanese spirit. Not the twisted version used centuries later to control men. The true version. The one that was meant to save men like you. Tadayoshi leaned in, listening as though absorbing sacred scripture. Originally, Ko said, Yamato Damashi had nothing to do with nationalism or blind loyalty. It meant something far more personal. It meant becoming a man whose actions are rooted in identity, not emotion. A man who moves because he must, not because he feels like it. The fire crackled louder, sparks rising into the cold night. Your struggle isn't that you lack knowledge, Ko said. It's that you've lived separated from your own spirit. You knew the path intellectually, but you never stepped onto it. Your thoughts were sharp, but your will was thin. Tadayoshi lowered his gaze, ashamed. But Ko wasn't condemning him, he was revealing something. Yamato Damashi, Ko said softly, exists to bridge that divide. To turn knowing into doing. To turn plans into presence. To turn a timid scholar into a warrior of spirit. Tadayoshi looked up. For the first time, he understood the depth of what he was learning. He wasn't training to swing a sword. He was training to become someone who didn't run from life. Ko stood and dusted off his hands. Rest tonight. Tomorrow, we continue shaping your spirit. And understand this, Tadayoshi, Ko met his eyes with a rare, powerful seriousness. What you're fighting is not the cold, not the pain, not even me. He pointed a finger at Tadayoshi's chest. You're fighting the version of yourself that has ruled you for years. The fire hissed. The river roared. And for the first time, Tadayoshi felt prepared to win that fight. The following week marked the beginning of Tadayoshi's true transformation. Not because his body grew stronger, though it did, but because something inside him finally began to reorganize itself. The man who once waited for the right feeling to act was slowly dying, replaced by someone who showed up regardless of how he felt. By the 7th morning, he no longer hesitated at the door of his home. He no longer paused to consider whether he wanted to train. His body simply rose, moved, and walked. It was as if his feet understood the path better than his thoughts did. Ko noticed the shift immediately. You're quieter, the master observed on the 10th morning. Tadayoshi didn't understand. Quieter? Ko nodded. Your mind was once a storm. Now it's becoming a river. Still moving, but with purpose. Training intensified. Stances grew longer. Movements became more precise. Ko added footwork drills, balance exercises, controlled breathing, and long periods of silent meditation in the forest. Tadayoshi wasn't just learning physical discipline, he was being sculpted from within. His doubts still surfaced, but they no longer commanded him. His emotions still rose, but they no longer dictated his choices. One day, Ko introduced a new practice. At dawn, he placed a heavy stone into Tadayoshi's hands. Carry this with you during training, he said. Tadayoshi obeyed without question. He practiced stances with the stone weighing down his arms. He swung wooden swords while balancing it. He moved through the forest trails, sweating and stumbling, the stone growing heavier with every step. What is this for? Tadayoshi finally asked. Ko answered without looking at him. To teach you that you can do far more with burdens than without them. Everyone wants life to feel light before they act. Warriors act even when the weight is unbearable. The stone became a symbol, a reminder that his previous life was defined by waiting for perfect conditions. Now, he was learning to move under pressure, not around it. By week 8, something remarkable happened. Tadayoshi began waking before sunrise, without Ko having to call for him. His body anticipated the work ahead, as if it had accepted discipline not as a task, but as a natural state of being. Even on days when his legs felt as heavy as iron or his arms trembled from exhaustion, he showed up. Not with enthusiasm, not with excitement, but with certainty. Ko watched from the shadows one morning as Tadayoshi trained alone, repeating a sequence of moves with steady breaths and unwavering focus. The old master smiled faintly. This was no longer a boy pretending to be a warrior. This was someone becoming a warrior by choice, by action, by identity. Later that day, Ko approached him. "You're beginning to understand," he said. "Understand what?" Tadayoshi asked between breaths. "That discipline isn't about force," Ko replied. "It's about alignment. When your actions match the man you claim to be, effort disappears. Only duty remains." Tadayoshi felt those words settle deep within him. He wasn't forcing himself anymore. He was finally becoming himself. As the months passed, Tadayoshi's transformation became undeniable. The boy who once hid behind books and theories had evolved into someone entirely different, someone whose presence carried a quiet weight. Even the forest seemed to respond to him differently now. When he walked, the air felt calmer. His steps were grounded, stable, deliberate. He no longer moved like a man questioning himself. He moved like a man who had stopped seeking permission from his feelings. But Ko knew the journey wasn't complete. One evening, long after training had ended, Ko called Tadayoshi to the top of a steep hill overlooking the valley. The sky was an ocean of red and gold, the sun sinking slowly behind the mountains. Ko stood with his hands behind his back, the wind rustling the edges of his cloak. "Tadayoshi," he said, "there is one final lesson you must learn." Tadayoshi approached, his breath still heavy from the day's training. "I'm ready, master." Ko shook his head. "You are ready to endure. You are ready to act. But you are not yet ready to live as a warrior." Tadayoshi frowned, confused. "What am I missing?" Ko turned to face him fully. His eyes, usually sharp and unyielding, now held a depth that Tadayoshi had never seen before. "A warrior does not train for training's sake," he began. "He trains so that when life demands something of him, his spirit answers instantly, without hesitation, without doubt, without fear." He gestured toward the valley below. "Look at the world. People suffer not because they are weak, but because they live out of alignment with themselves. They wait for motivation. They wait for courage. They wait for the right moment. But life does not wait." Tadayoshi lowered his gaze, the truth settling heavily in his chest. "You have felt pain here," Ko continued. "You have faced cold, exhaustion, and failure. But soon you must face the real world, where challenges do not announce themselves, and where hesitation can become regret." He stepped closer. "You must learn to trust the man you have become." Silence fell between them, broken only by the wind. Tadayoshi felt something stirring inside him, not fear, not doubt, but a quiet awareness that Ko was right. He had grown stronger, more disciplined, more present, yet there was one part of him that still clung to the past, the part that wondered whether he was truly enough. Ko placed a hand on Tadayoshi's shoulder, a gesture so rare it startled him. "Listen to me," the old master said softly. "Your enemy was never weakness. It was hesitation. And you have begun to conquer it." He squeezed Tadayoshi's shoulder lightly. "Now your task is simple, live without returning to the man you once were. Do not wait for perfect days. Do not wait for courage. Act because action is your nature now." As the sun dipped below the mountains, painting the sky in the final colors of day, Tadayoshi finally understood the lesson he had been chasing since the beginning. He wasn't training to become someone new. He was training to reveal the person he had always been capable of becoming. And that realization, calm, powerful, and steady, marked the true beginning of his life as a warrior.